We don't deserve to be the master race. Black or white, us or them, either or. That's saying all the time.
So, can you tell the story of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1939? So they make an agreement, Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, and that leads us, just like you mentioned, in a matter of days.
Yeah.
How compact everything is. It's just really, really fascinating.
It's a beautiful summer in Europe, summer of 1939, you know. It's one of these sort of glorious summers that sort of never rains. It's just sunshine, sunny day after sunny day. It's kind of, you know, it's like that sort of golden summer of 1914 as well.
I hate
where the sky always seems to be blue, fluffy white clouds, everyone's sort of, you know, but this sort of, the storm clouds of war, to use that cliche, are kind of brewing. The Russians have reached out to Britain and France and said, come on over, let's negotiate, you know, let's see what we can do. And there is just no stomach for that at all. I mean, if ever there is I think, a mistake, that's Britain and France should have been a bit more into real politics than they were. It's such an opportunity to ensure that to snooker the Third Reich, and they don't take it. Because, you know, in many ways they see the westward spread of communism in exactly the same way that the Nazis see the threat of the westward spread of communism as something that's every bit as repellent as Nazism, and they don't want to be getting into bed with these guys. Of course, they kind of have to change tack on that one in summer of 1941 in very quick order. And that's the whole point about Churchill appeasing Stalin. I mean, you know, it's all very well people saying, well, you know, Churchill wouldn't have appeased Hitler in the 1930s, but he does appease. He appeases all the time. And they missed that opportunity. And the French and British delegation is third-tier commanders, generals going over. It's a shit show. I mean, excuse my French, but I mean, it's just it's a nonsense. That they're not ready for it, they're not prepared. The British guy, Admiral Drax, doesn't have any authority. The whole thing's a complete joke. It's never going to get anywhere.
You tell the story of this quite beautifully, actually. Again, it's such a human story. I mean, it seems like the Stalin and Soviet...
They've already made up their mind.
But
I don't think they have. I think
wait. I mean, you described quite well that they value in-person meeting.
Yes.
So, like, Chamberlain should have just gone to Moscow.
Yeah, get on a plane.
Like, it's such a, maybe it's a simplistic notion, but that could have changed the trajectory of human history right there.
I really think it could have done. I think that's much more grievous mistake than Munich.
Why are leaders so hesitant to meet? I'm told now by a bunch of diplomats that no, there's a process. You know, first you have to have these diplomats meet, and they have to draft a bunch of stuff. And I sometimes have this simplistic notion, like, why not meet? Why not meet? Like, I think there is a human element there. And of course, especially when there's this force that is Hitler.
Well, yes, and because we humans, we like to interact.
Yeah.
And you like to see people in 3 dimensions. And, you know, I'm sure it's why you always quite rightly insist on doing your podcast face to face. Because you want to get the cut of someone's jib, and you want to be able to see them, and you want to see the intonation and the expression and the whites of their eyes and all that kind of stuff. And that just does make a difference, of course, because, you know, we're fundamentally animals, and we want to be sizing people up. And it's much easier to do that when you're a few feet away from each other than it is on a video screen or through the prism of someone else.
Yeah, but there's also just, you see the humanity in others. It's so much easier. You see this in social media. It's so much easier to talk shit about others when you're not with them.
Yes.
And like, military conflict is the extreme version of that.
Yeah.
You can construct these narratives that they're not human, that they're evil, you can construct communist ideology, all these, you can project onto them the worst possible version of a human. But when you meet them, you're like, oh,
they are just a person.
They're just a person.
Well, it's the world's great tragedy that it's only a few people that want to go to war, and the vast majority want to live happily, contented lives getting on with their neighbours. I mean, it has been ever thus. It's just
It is those few
that kind of ruin it for everybody else. But anyway, to go back to Leningrad, back in August 1939, they go half cock. They're disrespectful to Soviet Union as a result of that. It gets nowhere. Had they been able to put in a really, really firm offer there and then to the Soviet Union would have probably come in. I mean, the big thing is that the Soviet Union said, this is a big stumbling block. The Soviet Union said, yeah, but we want to be able to march through Poland if we get threatened by Germany. But the British and the French just smell a massive rat there. They're basically saying, you know, if they agree to that, what they fear is that the Soviet Union will just march into Poland and go, yeah, but you said we could, and take it, which they unquestionably would have done. But it would have stopped the World War, probably.
They're willing to appease Hitler. They're not willing to appease Stalin in that situation.
Well, they're not willing to appease anybody by that stage, that's the point.
Well, they appeased Hitler. Because
there's a bottom line, you know, which is Poland. You know, so it's changed. That's
right.
why.
Right.
But anyway, the bottom line is they don't. You know, there is a reluctance on the British to negotiate with the Soviet Union because they're communists. Don't mind them. Don't trust them. Worry about what they're going to do with Poland, and they're going to be, you know, jumping out of the fire into the kind of water, and it doesn't come off. And as a consequence of that, the Soviet Union continue to pursue more hardly, you know, more vociferously the opportunities that the Germans are offering, which is this split of Poland. Because the Soviet Union wants that part of Poland back in its own sphere of influence, and it doesn't want to go to war just yet.
And the agreement that they won't attack each other, essentially. Do you think Stalin actually believed that?
No, he believed it in the same way that Hitler believed it, that it was a cynical kind of, you know, convenient bit of realpolitik for now. I mean, I think the Soviet Union was as determined to get rid of the Nazis as the Nazis were determined to get rid of the Soviet Union. I think whoever fired first was not decided at that point, but I do think that from the moment that Hitler takes power in 1933, a conflict between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany is inevitable.
Yes, but either direction you think is inevitable.
Yeah.
I think there's a huge amount of evidence for that. Stalin probably wanted it, like in 42, 43?
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah, and you know, they're doing exercises and stuff and building up. He's not ready yet because he knows he's done the purges and he's got to get his army, you know, he's got to get his armed forces back into shape and all the rest of it, but, you know. So they have this incredibly cynical agreement, but at that point, you know, Hitler's hands are untied. You know, he no longer has to worry about the threat from the Soviet Union. He's got carte blanche to go into Poland, and he doesn't believe that France and Britain are going to go to war over Poland. He's wrong about that, obviously. But France and Britain, despite going to war with him, still do nothing. So, you know, he's got away with it.
Who was Churchill? And how did Churchill come to power at this moment?
Well, Churchill is this absolutely towering figure in British politics. You know, he's been, you know, his first minister in the kind of noughties of the 20th century, in the first years of the 20th century. Close to the Liberals and the Conservatives. He's a former Chancellor of the Exchequer. He's a towering figure. But he's been in the wilderness because he's out of favour with the Stanley Baldwin government. He's out of favour with Chamberlain, but he is this towering figure, and he has been very outspoken as a backbencher, which basically means, you know, you're not a minister, you're not in the cabinet, you're just an ordinary member of parliament. But obviously, you're an ordinary member of parliament, but you're also an ordinary member of parliament who has had ministries of state and who is this towering figure. So he's listened to in a way that other backbenchers aren't. And he has been saying, you know, we need to stand up to the dictators, we need to do this. We need to rearm more heavily, and blah, blah, blah. So when war is declared, he's brought back into the Admiralty in charge of the Navy, which is Britain's senior service, and suddenly he's there. And what happens is Britain doesn't really do anything. It's very difficult working with France because France is so politically fractured that they can't make any decisions. When you can't make any decisions, you're just impotent. And so Churchill first mentions going into Norway and mining the leads. So the idea is that you're making life very difficult for the Germans to get iron ore out of Sweden. Their main source of iron ore is up in the northern part of Sweden in the Arctic Circle.
Really?
It gets on a railway through northern tip of Norway and then gets shipped down the west coast of Norway into Germany, into the Baltic. So Churchill suggests in September 1939, why don't we mine the leads, which are the leads are these passageways out of the fjords in the north into the North Sea. Why don't we mine those and stop the Germans from taking this? Everyone goes, well, yeah, that's quite a good idea, but they can't decide, and French are nervous that if they do that, the Germans will retaliate and bomb France and all this kind of stuff. So no decision is made until kind of April 1940. They go up to start mining the leads on exactly the same day that the Germans invade Denmark and Norway, and so they're caught off guard. So at that moment, really, it's seen as a failure of Chamberlain's government, and there is a kind of a mounting realization that no matter how good he was or competent he was as a peacetime prime minister, he's not a wartime prime minister. You know, he's not served in the armed forces himself, doesn't really understand it. It needs a different set of hands. And his government falls on the 9th of May. It becomes inevitable that he's going to have to resign. And the obvious person to take his place is Lord Halifax, who is in the House of Lords, but he can still be a prime minister. And he is, without question, the most respected politician in the country. He's the former Viceroy of India. He's seen as an incredibly safe pair of hands, man of resolute, sound judgment, etc., etc. But he doesn't want to take it. He feels physically ill at the prospect, doesn't want this responsibility. He's also not really a military man. He's got a slightly sort of withered hand, which has prevented him from doing military service. And he just blanches at this moment. And that really leaves only one other figure that could possibly take on this position, and that's Churchill. So when Chamberlain resigns on the 9th of May and Halifax says it's not for me, the only person who's going to slip into that position is Churchill, and he becomes prime minister, and he accepts it gladly. He feels like this is his mission in life. This is his moment. Cometh the hour, cometh the man. But he comes with a huge amount of baggage. I mean, you know, he's known as a man who drinks too much, whose judgment hasn't always been great. You know, he was chancellor during the time of the General Strike, 1926. You know, he backed Edward VIII over the monarchy crisis when the king wanted to marry Wallis Simpson, the divorcee, Catholic divorcee, etc., etc. So, you know, his judgment has been brought into question. You know, he is the man who came up with the idea of the Gallipoli campaign, which was, you know, an ignominious failure, blah, blah, blah. So there are issues over him. You know, he is seen as a hothead and a man who doesn't have the kind of sound judgment of Halifax. So the jury is very much out. And I think it's one of those things where you have to put yourself in, you have to look at this through the prism of what people were thinking in May 1940. Yes, he was considered a towering politician, but he is seen also as a loose cannon and by no means the right person in this hour of darkness. And it is coincidental that the 10th of May 1940, when he takes over as prime minister, he becomes prime minister, not through an election but by default, of a new nationalist government. So no longer a conservative government, but a nationalist cross-party coalition government for the duration of the war, which includes, you know, members of the Liberal Party and also the Labour Party, as well as Conservatives. That it is by no means certain that he's going to be able to deliver the goods. And it is also coincidentally the same day that the Germans launched Case Yellow, Operation Yellow, the invasion of the Low Countries and France. So these are tumultuous events, to put it mildly. And it is also the case that, you know, only a couple of weeks before, Paul Greyneau has taken over as prime minister of yet another coalition government in France from Daladier. So political turmoil is very much the watchword at this time for the Western democracies, just at the moment that the Germans are making their kind of, you know, their hammer strike into the West.
This might be a good moment to bring up this idea that has been circulating recently, brought up by Daryl Cooper, who hyperbolically stated that Churchill was the, quote, chief villain of the Second World War. To give a good faith interpretation of that, I believe he meant that Churchill forced Hitler to escalate the expansion of Nazi Germany beyond Poland into a global war. So Churchill is the one that turned this narrow war, Czechoslovakia, Austria, Poland, into a global one. Is that accurate?
No, I don't think it is. I mean, not least because the decisions over Poland were made by Chamberlain's government, not when Churchill was out of government. So, Churchill wasn't even involved in that decision-making process at the time. No, I don't think so. I mean, again, I go back to kind of Britain's position in the world in 1939.
Mhm.
If you say we are going to defend the sovereignty of Poland and then you don't, that looks really bad globally. Britain's prestige would plummet, would lead to all sorts of problems. You are saying that you're giving carte blanche to dictators to just run amok and take whatever territory they want. You are risking the future upheaval of the global order away from democracies into the hands of dictators. In the West, people believe in democracy and believe in the advancement of and freedoms of people. This is, to echo the words of Roosevelt in August 1941. That they're aspiring to a world free of want and fear. Now, obviously, there's still some issues with the form that democracy takes in the 1930s. It's not democratic for everyone. Try saying that if you're in Nigeria or India or whatever, or if you're in the black southern states of the United States. But the aspirations are there, and I think that's an important distinction.
Mm-hmm.
And I think by saying that Churchill is the chief warmonger of the Second World War, I think is ludicrous. It's the same thing about the bombing. The detractors of strategic air campaign always go, yeah, but Germans had the Holocaust, but weren't the Allies just as bad, just killing all those civilians? It's like, no, because the moment Hitler stopped the war, the bombing would stop. The moment the war stopped in Hitler's favor, the killing would continue and be accelerated.
So the thing you mentioned initially is this sort of the idealist perspective of, well, Britain can't allow sort of this warmonger to break all these pacts and be undemocratic, murder a large number of people and do conquest of territory. Okay, that's idealistic, but if we look at the realist perspective, what decisions would minimize the amount of suffering on the continent in the next 50 years? So one of the arguments that he's making, I happen to disagree with it, to put it mildly, is that Churchill increased the amount of suffering. So Churchill's presence and decisions. So we're not talking about idealistic perspective. We're talking about a realist, like the reality of the war, of Stalin, of Hitler, of Churchill, of France and FDR. Did Churchill drag Hitler into a world war? Did he force Hitler to invade the Soviet Union? Did he force Hitler to...
The problem with stupid nonsense opinions that circle around is the fact that we're wasting our breath over debunking them instead of going ahead and discuss interesting details and important facts.
To then invade, attack Britain.
Well, no, because Hitler was always going to invade the Soviet Union unless the Soviet Union invaded Germany first. So that was always going to happen. No one asked Hitler to invade the Low Countries and Norway and Denmark and attack Britain. He does that, of course, because he's not given a free hand in Poland. But there's no question that Hitler would have also wanted to subdue France, or certainly turn France from a democracy into a totalitarian state as well. I'm absolutely certain about that.
I think there's pretty definitive evidence. I mean, it's obvious from everything he said, from everything he's written, from everything, everywhere, that he was going to invade the Soviet Union, no matter what. Yep. And France, most likely, yes, also.
He would have done a deal with Britain. Britain could have existed.
So actually, there is a possible reality. I don't know. Maybe you can correct me on this. Where Hitler basically takes all of Europe except Britain.
Yes, but then he would go so strong that he would have then turned on Britain as well. Because he would. The fear is that if you let him do this, and then he gets greedy, he wants the next one, then he wants the next one, then he wants the next one, and then he wants to take over the whole world. And that is the fear of the British. That is the fear of the Americans. That's the fear of President Roosevelt, who's got a we haven't even touched on this yet, but he has a very difficult case on his hands because he's come into power also in January 1933 as President of the United States on an isolationist ticket, with a retrenching, with a kind of sort of, step away from the European old order. It's time for the Europeans to start on their own. It all sounds very familiar right now. And suddenly he's got to do this gargantuan political volte-face and prepare the nation for war, because he also fears, like Churchill fears, like Chamberlain feared as well, that Hitler's designs are not purely on Eastern Europe and the Lebensraum there, but would get ever bigger. And I don't doubt that they're right. I think if you'd prevailed in the Soviet Union, you'd always wanted more, because his whole concept is the master race.
Yeah, I think it should be said, if we measure human suffering, if there was not Britain on the other side, if it was not a two-front war, that the chances of Hitler succeeding in the Soviet Union is much higher, or at least a more prolonged war, and there would be more dead, and more enslaved, and more tortured, and all of this.
Yes, and ditto if if the Allies hadn't got involved against Imperial Japan, it would have been catastrophic. I mean, 20 to 30 million Chinese dead anyway, with American and British intervention. What's it going to be in China without that? I mean, and elsewhere. Because the reason why Japan invades French Indochina, now Vietnam, and Hong Kong, and Malaya, and Singapore, and so on, and Burma, is because it's not winning in China, and it needs more resources because it's resource poor, and America has cut off the tap. So it's going into these countries to get what it needs. It's rubber and oil and natural resources and ores, precious ores, and all the rest of it. And if it had been unchecked, it would have done so. And then it would have absolutely built up its strength and overrun the whole of China with even more deaths. So, I think that one of the interesting things about the Second World War is lots of wars and why people get involved in them are extremely questionable. But I think there is a moral crusade to the Allies and what they're doing that I think is entirely justified. What I think is interesting also is that as the war progresses, if the Allies are supposed to be on the force of the good, how come they're doing so much bad? And at what point is doing bad stopping you from doing good? And at what point are you doing good but also doing bad at the same time? Such as destruction of cities, destruction of monasteries on outcrops in southern Italy, destruction of killing of lots of civilians, etc., etc. These are difficult questions to answer sometimes. They're also incredibly interesting, and I think that moral component starts to blur a little bit by kind of middle of the war, by 1943. It's kind of easy to have a fairly cut and dry war in North Africa, in the deserts of North Africa, where the only people getting in the way are a few sort of Bedouin tribesmen or something. But once you start getting into Europe or getting into the kind of the meat of highly populated countries in the Far East, for example, that's a different kettle of fish, because the scale of destruction is absolutely immense. But it is also the job of political leaders to look after and defend their own peoples first and foremost. And so what you're doing is you're trying to protect your own sovereignty, your own people, before you're protecting other people. And so that's what leads to, the whole way in which the Western Allies are protracting war is to try and minimize the number of deaths of their own young men as much as they possibly can, whilst at the same time winning the war. And that means bringing lots of destruction to your enemies, but also trying to minimize it. And the way you bring lots of destruction to your enemies is by using immense firepower and this concept of steel, not our flesh, which I mentioned earlier on, and technology, so that you don't have to bring to bear too many of your young men's lives, and you don't have a repeat of the slaughter of the First World War. So, it is really interesting that in our mind's eye, when we're thinking of the Western Allies in the Second World War, probably the first thing that comes into mind is Americans jumping out of landing craft on Omaha Beach on D-Day, for example. Those are infantrymen. They're the front line. They are the coalface. They're the first people going into the fire of the enemy. And we tend to think about guys in tanks, infantrymen with their Garand rifles or machine guns or whatever. That's what springs to mind. Yet actually, they're a comparatively small proportion of the army. So no more than 14 to 15% of any army, Allied army, is infantry. 45% are service corps, service troops, driving trucks and cooks and bottle washers and people lugging gravy boxes of stuff. That's because by that stage, the Allies have worked out the way of war, which is to use what I call big war. This concept of a very long tail, logistics, the operational art, making sure that people have the absolute best you possibly can, great medical care, huge advances in first aid and medical care of troops, getting them back onto the battlefield. And you're using firepower and technology and mechanization to do a lot of your hard yards. So, that's the principle behind strategic bombing. If you go over and bomb and you can destroy infrastructure and civilians and households, that makes it much harder for Krupp to make those Panther tanks and Tiger tanks or whatever it might be, and guns. And you're disrupting the transportation system in Germany. You're making life difficult for them to do what they need to do. Then that means it's going to be easier for those 15% of infantrymen who've got to jump out of landing craft to do their job. And you're trying to keep that to a minimum. And you'd have to say, broadly speaking, that's a very sensible policy that makes an awful lot of sense. Consequence of that is a huge amount of destruction. And maybe that's what Daryl Cooper's driving at. But no one asked Hitler to invade Poland. I mean, that is the bottom line. No one asked Germany to go to war. No one asked Hitler to come up with these ludicrous ideology.
Yeah, there's complex ethical discussions here about just like as you described,
which are fascinating.
And war is hell, and there's many ways in which it is hell. Just for a little bit to steel man what Daryl is, where he might be coming from, is since World War II, the simplistic veneration of Churchill, sort of saying Churchill good, Hitler bad, has been used as a template to project onto other conflicts to justify military intervention. And so his and other people like libertarians, for example, resistance to that overly simplistic veneration of somebody like Churchill has to do with the fact that seems to be by neocons and warmongers in the military-industrial complex in the United States and elsewhere, using Hitler way too much, using Churchill way too much to justify invading everywhere and anywhere.
Well, I do agree with that. I think oversimplification of anything is a mistake. Life is nuance. The past is nuance. It's okay to be proud about certain things, and it's okay to be disgusted by other things. That's absolutely fine. We have a complicated relationship with our past. It doesn't need to be black and white. And life is not a straight line. And of course, the Allies made plenty of mistakes in World War II.
Because they're fucking human.
I think they made the right calls. And I think one of the things that's really interesting is I think that the Allies, for the most part, used their resources much more judiciously and sensibly than the Axis powers do. And, good, because that means they prevail. I think, there are so many lessons from World War II that could have been brought into the history of the last 30 years, which weren't. Such as, if you decapitate an incredibly strong leader, you get a power vacuum, and you don't have what happens in Iraq. And so, Donald Rumsfeld going, we don't do reconstruction. Well, you freaking well should do. If you're gonna take on this particular challenge, you've got to see it through. That's simply not good enough. It's not good enough to go into Afghanistan and go, okay, we're going to change things around. It's going to be great. All the women are going to have education. They won't have to wear they won't have to cover up their bodies anymore. Yeah, anything goes. We love liberalism. It's great. Let's make Kabul into a thriving city once more, and then suddenly bug out. Because what's going to happen? You're going to undo everything. And I remember being in, this is a bit of a segue, Lex, but I remember being in Northern Helmand province back in, when was it, January 2008. And British troops had just taken over an absolute dump of a town called Musakala. And I remember talking to this Afghan guy. He just had all his willow trees chopped down to make room for a helipad the Allies wanted, which they, they put their kind of those cages with kind of rubble in the protective wall. Is it called Hesco? I think it was called. Anyway, I said to him, what do you think about the British being there? And he just went, he shrugged at me and lifted up his hands and said, well, if they stay, great, but they won't. And he said, if they stay, they're brilliant. But he said, I'll tell you what, he said, Taliban weren't great, they weren't fantastic. He said, but I could leave my personal wall and no one would touch it. I could leave it on a wall for a week, no one would touch it. Said, will they bring that kind of order? Will we have peace here? They've just chopped down my willow trees. Thanks a lot. And you're seeing a total lack of understanding of the culture, the ethnic differences. You're trying to impose a kind of Western-centric view onto something which is just onto a nation which isn't ready for that. Now there are ways in which it looked like Afghanistan was starting to kind of emerge, and there was a path, and then just at the critical moment, the West moves out with catastrophic consequences. What you have to say, though, is that in the West, post-1945, the rehabilitation of Italy, of Japan, of Western Germany was really good. The consequence of all that destruction, all that turmoil, was thriving, high-producing democracies, which burst forth into the kind of second half of the 20th century and into the 21st century in pretty good order. So the lessons of the previous generation from the First World War had been learned, even though the scale of destruction, the displacement of people is unprecedented in 1945.
In 1939, what was the state of the militaries? What were the most powerful militaries on the world stage at that time?
Well, in terms of naval power, Britain, as we've already discussed, and the United States, France has a pretty large navy. Japan has a pretty large navy. Italy has a pretty large navy, but Italy's navy is by far and away its most modern aspect of its three services, air, land, and sea. But it doesn't have any aircraft carriers. It doesn't have any radar. So it's they've got modern battleships and battle cruisers, but without key modern bits of technology.
So Italy is really not ready for war.
Oh, it's so not. It's so not. It's just, again, both Hitler and Mussolini, they lack geopolitical understanding. That's because they're so kind of focused on their narrow worldview, and they view everything through that prism, that they can't see that bigger picture.
And we should say that Mussolini, maybe you can correct me, but I don't think at any point he wants a war.
He doesn't want a war. What he does want is he wants his own new kind of Roman Empire, which extends over the Mediterranean, the kind of certainly the eastern part of the half of the Mediterranean, North Africa, all the way down to kind of East Africa, controlling the Suez Canal. That's what he wants.
And I think he made clear that he was. There's always like this little brother jealous of Hitler kind of situation, because he wanted absolute power the way Hitler did,
but doesn't have it.
Doesn't have it. It's described.
Yeah, there's a monarchy, often forgotten. It's amazing.
So there's always this limit, and Hitler, quite brilliantly, once he gets some power, he takes it all. Complete.
He completely emasculates Mussolini. And yeah, he likes him though. It's really weird. Even when Mussolini's about to fall in July 1943, he has a meeting at Feltre. Just literally a few days before Mussolini tumbles, and he does that because he likes Mussolini. He likes him as a man and thinks he's been his friend, and he respects him to a certain extent, even though he definitely views himself as top dog. Hitler does, that is. So it's kind of curious, because I don't think Hitler particularly likes anyone really, but he does seem to like Mussolini. But anyway, The problem with Mussolini is Mussolini's Italy is very impoverished from the First World War. And that of course leads to the rise of fascism and the overthrow of parliamentary democracy, and why Mussolini takes place in the first place. Again, it's that kind of, there's been this terrible disruption, there's been financial crisis, that leads to kind of people looking at an alternative. What's the alternative? Well, Mussolini's going, we can be proud Italians again, lots of chest thumping, wearing great uniforms, all the rest of it. And people kind of think, well, a piece of that. It kind of works, and, proverbially the trains work on time under him, and so on and so forth. But he just gets ahead of himself, and actually the writings on the war in 1935 when he goes into Abyssinia, and again, sort of, but effectively a kind of my first world European standards primitive tribesmen in Abyssinia, they have quite a tough fight there. They do prevail, but it's not a complete walkover, and they get a bit of a bloody nose at times, and they shouldn't have done. And they're just not ready. They don't have the industry. They're tied up into the Mediterranean. They don't have access to the world's oceans. They do have some merchant shipping, but not a huge amount. They just don't have what is required. They're dependent on Britain for coal. Britain is the leading coal exporter in the world in the 1930s. So Britain's approach to fascist Spain and approach to fascist Italy has been very much sort of stick and carrot. It's like, we'll let you do what you do as long as you kind of stay in your box, and we'll continue to provide you with supplies and coal and whatever it is you need, as long as you don't kind of go too far. And so that's why Mussolini is very anxious in 1938 and again in 1939 to kind of be the power broker and kind of not let Germany go to war. But Germany is just, they signed the Axis Pact of Steel in May 1939, where they become formal allies. This is Hitler and Mussolini, Italy and Germany. But it's always a very, very unequal partnership wherever the word go. And one of the reasons Mussolini signs it is because he fears that Germany has designs on Italy.
Yeah.
It's not because he thinks, oh, these guys are great, they're our natural bedfellows. It's so that he can, it's a mutually convenient pact whereby Germany gets on with whatever it wants to do up in Northern Europe and Eastern Europe. Italy is given a free hand to do whatever it wants to do. They'll just kind of watch each other's backs. They have borders, Austria and Italy border one another, and they'll just do their own thing, and they'll kind of help each other out with supplies and stuff. But basically, they won't. They'll be their own. It's a kind of marriage of convenience. They're never expected to be fighting alongside each other on the battlefield. Not really. There is a kind of obligation to do so, but it's an obligation with no expectation of ever actually happening. And so from Mussolini's point of view, the Pact of Steel is kind of, it's just sailing your flag to one particular mast and kind of trying to cover your back. And so long as he plays his cards right, he can still get his coal supplies from Britain. He doesn't have to worry about that. The Pact of Steel doesn't make any difference to that. The problem for him is that in June 1940, he thinks that France is about to be defeated and that Britain will surely follow. And so he thinks, I've got some rich pickings. I can take Malta, I can take British possessions, I can overrun Egypt, and now is my time. But I also need to kind of join the fight before France is completely out of the fight. Otherwise, it looks like I'm a Johnny-come-lately, and I won't.
Okay. What are we going to do here? What we have here is the very distinct sharp edge at the clavicle, which if I get this shape right, okay, I would get the shoulders, clavicle, and the twist. Okay, I think I got it. Because my mistake was initially thinking of working on the deltoid muscles more, but what actually requires for the description of this twist is to get this shape right. And this shape starts with the sharp edge over here and get lost edgy despite the contrast here for the armpit. It gets lost edge over here, so I kind of have to make this less distinct. I need a warmer tone. And then this shape is totally right, but there's a cast shadow of the arm over here, which gonna help with the description of this shape. Okay, so what I need is a capturing the cast shadow of the arm correctly and paying attention to the direction so it would follow the twist of the torso all the way up, and then that shape would catch everything. Okay, got it.
I won't get those spoils because the Germans will go, yeah, you can't have all this stuff. You've turned up too late. You need to be in the fight. So he does it, what he thinks is the perfect timing. And it turns out to be a catastrophic timing because, of course, Britain doesn't exit the fight. You know, Britain is still there. And, you know, by February 1941, a very, very tiny British army in Egypt has overrun, you know, 2 entire Italian armies and taken 133,000 prisoners in North Africa.
So you mentioned in the sea, who were the dominant armies? Who was dominant in the air?
Well, in the air, it has to be the Luftwaffe, and it is also the Imperial Japanese, both in the Imperial Japanese Navy and the Imperial Japanese Army. They both have air forces. And one of the reasons that is because the quality of the pilots in Japan is extremely high because it's so difficult to get to the top position. You know, you are going to your frontline squadrons with at least 500 hours in your logbook. To put that into some perspective, you know, a British RAF or Luftwaffe pilot would be joining their frontline squadrons with 150 to 170 hours in the logbook. So it is that these guys are disciplined to within an inch of their lives. They are, you know, there are academic tests as well as physical endurance tests. You know, they are the elite of the elite, and they are extremely good. The problem they have is that there is a good number of them, but there's not that many. The Luftwaffe is the largest air force in the world in 1939, but it is already at a parity in aircraft production with Britain, and the French have a kind of similar sized army, but they're very, very badly organised. So they're organised into different regions, and one region is not really talking to another. And one of the problems that when Case Yellow, the German invasion of the West, starts, France's army of the air is spread throughout France and has its own little areas. So you have one bunch of, you know, fighters and bombers in that block in the Marseille area. You have another block in kind of, you know, on the Brittany coast, and you have another block in around Sedan, and you have another that. So consequently, they're never able to kind of bring their full strength to bear. So it's although they've both got about 3,500 aircraft on paper, and about 2,500 that are fit to fly on any one given day, the Luftwaffe, because they're the aggressor, can choose how they mass their aircraft and where they attack and at when. So, in other words, the Luftwaffe can send over overwhelming amounts of bombers and fighter planes and pulverize a French airfield and catch them napping. And because the French don't have a defense system, they can't see whether they're coming. So their only hope is to kind of take off and just hope they stooge around the sky and hope they bump into some Luftwaffe. And of course, that's inherently inefficient, and they get destroyed. And they get destroyed in penny packets rather than en masse. Difference with the RAF is the RAF is not done on an Air Force basis where you have each Air Corps or Air Fleet has a handful of bombers, a handful of fighters, a handful of reconnaissance planes. They have different commands. So they have Bomber Command, Fighter Command, Training Command, Coastal Command, and they all have very specific roles. So they're structured in a completely different way. And the other and that's because they're an island nation, and because they see their role militarily in a different way, and because the rearming that Britain has done in the 1930s is all about defence. It is not about aggression at this point, not about taking it to the enemy. It is showing you're tough, but also first and foremost getting your ducks in a row and making sure that you don't get defeated. So this is the principle behind the world's first fully coordinated air defense system, which is the radar chain, it is the observer corps, it is control rooms, it is interesting technology such as identification friend or foe, IFF, which is where you have a little pulse, so you have these control rooms and you have a map table and you have a tote board in front of you where you can see what squadrons are airborne, what state of readiness they're at, whether they're engaging the enemy, little lights come on and show you can see weather maps, you can see the cloud ceiling, you see all that at a glance. Then you're on a dais, and then down in front of you is a massive great map of southern England. You've got croupiers kind of moving plots, so you can, through a combination of radar, which picks up a kind of a rough idea of what's coming towards you, combined with the observer corps, you have overlapping observer corps stations all over Britain, covering every single inch of airspace over Britain, looking up into the air and seeing how many aircraft there are and at what height they are. And you have a little thing called a pantograph, which is a piece of equipment which helps you judge altitude. You then ring through that. That all comes into the control room along with the information from the radar stations, which is going into a single filter room at Fighter Command headquarters, which is then being pushed straight back out to the sector stations. So this information is being updated all the time. So you have a plot and it looks like it might be, enemy bombers 30 plus, for example. That's constantly being adapted. So as more information comes in, you will change that, and then you can see that actually it's only 20 aircraft or 22 aircraft or whatever. So you're updating that, and that little figure is put on your little plot and moved across, and so you can see. And then because you can identify your own aircraft, you can then see where they are moving, and you're also on. The guys in the air are on the radio to ground controllers who are in these control rooms, and they're saying, okay, well, if you proceed at, Angels 18,000 feet, on a vector of, 150 degrees, you should be seeing your enemy bombing formation any moment now. And what that means is that you're not on the ground when the enemy are coming towards you with their bombers to hit your airfield, which means you're in the air, so that all they're doing is hitting a grass airfield, which you've already got bulldozers and diggers and graders and lots of scalpings and earth ready to fill in the potholes, and it means you're good to go. And it means, as a consequence of all that, when the Germans do launch their all-out assault on Adlertag, Eagle Day, on the 13th of August 1940, the British are ready. They can see them coming, they know what to expect, and they can anticipate. And it means that they're not being caught with their trousers down on the ground. And as a consequence of that, of the 138 airfields there are in RAF airfields there are in Britain, only one of them is knocked out for more than 48 hours in the entire summer of 1940, and that's Manston on the tip of the Kent coast, which is abandoned for the duration.
So these are the two biggest air forces.
So those are the two biggest air forces.
So Luftwaffe, we should say, German. I mean, they're like the legendary, the terrifying Air Force.
Okay.
They are.
Maybe
They're slightly believing their own hype. There's no question about it.
Well, the rest of the world is also, right?
They've just had it too easy. So they don't have ground controllers. They don't have an air defense system in Germany, because why would you need an air defense system? We're going to be the aggressor. There's no scenario where we'll have to defend the airspace of the Third Reich because we're on the offensive. So they just haven't prepared it.
So there's that clash, the Battle of Britain, the clash of air forces. What explains the success of Britain in defending?
Well, everyone always says, the few were the last line of defense against the Nazi hordes and all this kind of stuff, and it's all rubbish. They're the first line of defense. But the second line of defense is the Royal Navy, which is the world's largest, and there is absolutely no chance on earth that a German invasion force made up of Rhine River barges, one out of every three is motorized and the other two aren't, is ever going to get successfully across the English Channel. And even if they did, they would be repulsed. I mean, it's just no chance. And it is often forgotten that while the Luftwaffe is coming over and bombing Britain every single day, so is the RAF going over and bombing Germany. And one of the problems that the Germans have is that these bombers need fighter protection. Fighter planes are there to protect the bombers, and they don't have much fuel. And the Messerschmitt 109E, the MEL, as the model is of 1940, is the mainstay of the German fighter force in the summer of 1940. And they don't have much fuel, so they need to conserve their fuel, which means they need to be as close to Britain as they possibly can, which is why the majority of them are all in airfields which are hastily created in July 1940 following the fall of France, in the Pas-de-Calais, which is the closest point. That's where the channel is its narrowest and all the rest of it, and also in the northern Normandy. And that's where they're flying from. But what that means is that even if you're completely rubbish at bombing, which the British are in 1940, they haven't developed those navigational aids to create untold accuracy by the end of the war. In 1940, they don't have that luxury. It's a target-rich environment. I mean, you can barely miss if you go to the Isle of, over to the Pas-de-Calais. I mean, it's just like one huge, great kind of hub of fighter airfields. And consequently, that means that every single German squadron, which only is 12 airplanes strong on establishment, and very often even fewer than that, always has to leave 2 airplanes behind to defend their own airfields. And it's really interesting when you look at kind of prisoner of war statements from Luftwaffe ground crew that have been downed. They're all bugged in a holding place called Trent Park. You can see the transcripts of these conversations. They're all going about how annoying it was that the RAF were over every night and they can't sleep. And, if only they'd just shut up and leave them alone and not bomb them. This is just part of the narrative of the Battle of Britain that's completely left out. It's always the stocky, the plucky few against the kind of the Nazi hordes and all the rest of it. And it's a complete misnomer. And by that time, aircraft production in Britain is massively outpacing the Germans. Yeah. And the best ratio that the Germans achieve in 1940 is July 1940, when the British produced 496 new Hurricanes and Spitfires single-engine fighters, and the Germans only produced 240 single-engine fighters. That's the best ratio. And of course, that is the British outproducing the Germans 2-1. And what that means is, by the end of October 1940, when the Battle of Britain is sort of, officially designated as being over, the single-engine fighter force of the Luftwaffe is less than 200, from 750 or whatever it was in the beginning of July. Whereas the British fighter force had been 650 or whatever at the beginning of July, is now well over 750.
And Britain is outproducing.
Yeah, to a massive degree. And that continues, and that is a ratio that just increases as the war progresses. I mean, Britain produces 132,500 aircraft in the Second World War. America produces 315,000.
So why is there this legend of the Luftwaffe?
Well, because it's the spearhead of the Blitzkrieg.
So it has to do with the Blitzkrieg.
It's all to do with the Blitzkrieg. the Luftwaffe becomes the kind of the bogeyman of the Third Reich. They're blamed for everything, but that's because they're completely abused. They're the only part of the Third Reich's armed services, the only part of the Wehrmacht being the Navy, the Army, and the Air Force, that is in constant use the whole time, or constant abuse, I should say. In Britain and America, they rotate their pilots really, really carefully. By the time that you've got the 8th Fighter Command, for example, part of the mighty 8th, the 8th Air Force operating in Britain. By the end of 1943, you would have, in a squadron that would have 16, you would never have more than 16 airborne from a squadron at any one time. Mm-hmm. You would have 40 to 45 pilots to service 16 in the air, and a similar number of aircraft, which means you're not overusing these guys. And what would happen is, by that stage of the war, by 1943, a young fighter pilot coming to a Thunderbolt squadron or a Mustang squadron, for example, at the end of 1943, beginning of 1944, he'd have 350 hours of consecutive flying. Because you can train in America, in Florida, or California, or Texas, or wherever, you can process many, many more people, because the training is much more intense, because you've got clear skies. So it's not a question of we'd like to take you out Fritz this morning, but it's a bit cloudy, and the RAF are over, or the 8th Air Force are over, so we can't fly today. So in Germany, pilot training is constant, aircrew training is constantly being interrupted by the war, by shortage of fuel, by inclement weather, etc., etc. In America, you have none of those problems. And Britain, because of its global reach, also has training bases in what was Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, in South Africa, in Canada as well. And so you're able to process these guys much better. You're able to give them more training. So that when they come, they're absolutely the finished article as pilots. What they're not the finished article as is, say, a bomber pilot or as a fighter pilot. But that's okay, because you join your squadron of 40 other guys for 16 airborne. And the old hands kind of take you up a few times. So you arrive at, I don't know, let's say some airfield in Suffolk, in East Anglia in England. And, you'll have 10 days to 2 weeks acclimatizing, getting used to it. The old hands will put you through your paces, give you some tips. You can pick their brains during kind of while you're having some chow and listening on some briefings. Then the first mission you do will be a milk run over to France, where the danger's kind of pretty minimal, and you can build up your experience. So by the time you're actually sent over on a mission to Berlin or Bremen or the Ruhr or whatever, you're absolutely in the business. So qualitatively and quantitatively, you are just vastly superior to anything the Luftwaffe's got. The Luftwaffe by that stage, in contrast, 1940, new pilots coming to frontline squadrons with 150, 170 hours on them in their logbooks. Less than 100, 190, 92 hours, something like that. It's not enough. And they're just being flung straight into battle, and they're getting absolutely slaughtered. And they're also, because their machines are quite complicated, there's no two-seaters really. So, no two-seater trainers. So the first time you're flying in your Focke-Wulf 190 or your Messerschmitt 109, it's this horrendous leap of faith, for which you, as a young, bright Luftwaffe fighter pilot, know that you're not ready for this. And it can bite you. Something like a Messerschmitt 109 has a very high wing loading, so it's very maneuverable in the air, but it's got these tiny wings. It's got this incredible torque, this Daimler-Benz DB605 engine with its huge amount of torque, and it just wants to flip you over. So if you're not used to it, and it's got a narrow undercarriage as well, if you're not used to it, you could just crash. So in the first couple of months of 1944, they lose something like 2,400 aircraft in the air and pilots, and about 3,400 are accidents.
So it has to do with training, really.
Yeah.
Not training enough.
It's training and resources and supply. And the Second World War, more than any other conflict, is a war of numbers. There are differences, the decisions that generals can make. There are moments where particular brilliance and bravery can seize the day, take the bridge, hold the enemy at bay or whatever. But ultimately, you're talking about differences which might make a month's difference, 6 months difference, maybe even several years difference. But ultimately, there was a certain point in the Second World War where the outcome is absolutely inevitable, because the guys that lose can't compete with the numbers that the guys are going to win.
So in that sense, you could think of World War II as a battle of factories.
Yes.
What does it take to win in the battle of factories, in out manufacturing military equipment against the Allies?
It's efficiency, really. So I was kind of, I was thinking, let's take the example of the Sherman tank, for example, the mainstay of the Western Allied forces, and a fair number of them sent to the Soviet Union as well, for that matter.
I think you've said it doesn't get the respect it deserves, maybe?
It doesn't get the respect it deserves. So the Sherman tank, the 75mm main battle gun, which is that sort of medium velocity, can fire a shell around kind of 2,000 feet per second, compared to the notorious, infamous German 88mm, which can fire at kind of third fast again, like 3,000 feet per second. But on paper, a Tiger tank coming around the corner and a Sherman tank coming around the corner, it should be no match at all. Tiger tank is 58 tons, looks scary, is scary, it's got a massive gun, got really thick armor. Sherman tank doesn't have as thick armor, it doesn't have a gun that's as big. It should be an absolute walkover. And yet, at about 5:30 p.m. on Monday the 26th of June 1944, a Sherman tank came around the corner of a road called a Rue Monsieur, a little village called Fontenay-le-Pesnel in Normandy, came face to face with a Tiger tank, and won. How does this happen? Well, I'll tell you how it happened, because the commander of the Sherman tank was experienced, had one up the spout. So what I mean by that is he had an armor-piercing round already in the breech. As soon as he saw the Tiger tank, he just said fire. That armor-piercing round did not penetrate the Tiger tank. It was never going to. But what it did do was it hit the gun mantlet, which is a bit of reinforced steel that you have just as the barrel is entering the turret. And that caused spalling, which is the little shards of little bits of molten metal, which then hit the driver of the Tiger tank in the head. And he was screaming, Gone Himmel or whatever, and we couldn't really see. The moment they got hit, the commander of the Tiger tank retreated into the turret of the Tiger. The moment you retreat into a turret, you can't see. You can see because you've got periscopes, but your visibility is nothing like as good as it is when you've got your head above the turret. Immediately after that, the armor-piercing round from the Sherman tank was repeated by a number of high explosive rounds, which are rounds which kind of detonate, have a little minor charge, then there's a second charge which creates lots of smoke, and in moments, in the first 30 seconds, 10 rounds from that Sherman tank had hit the Tiger tank before the Tiger tank had unleashed a single round itself, and the crew then surrendered. So you didn't need to destroy the Tiger tank; you just need to stop it operating. If it hasn't got a crew, it's just a chunk of metal that's inoperable. So that's all you need to do. And what that tells you is that experience counts, training counts. The agility of the Sherman tank also counts. It's a smaller shell, therefore it's easier to manhandle, which means you can put more in the breech quicker. There's features on a Sherman tank, like it's the first tank to have a gun stabilizing gyro, which means it's more effective on the move. There's also an override switch on the underside of the turret, so that the commander, if he just sees something out of the corner of his eye, can immediately start moving the turret before the gunner, who is down in the belly of the turret, can react. There's many different facts of it, but the main fact of all is that 1,347 Tigers built. There were 49,000 Shermans. So that means there's 36 Shermans to every single Tiger.
So you actually have an incredible video. You talk about this a lot from different angles about the top 5 tanks and the bottom 5 tanks in World War II. I think, was it the Tiger that made both the top 5 and the bottom 5?
The problem with the Tiger tank is it's really huge.
We should say that you keep saying the problem, but one of the pros of the Tiger tank,
It's very huge.
it's, I mean, the psychological warfare aspect of it is terrifying.
Yes.
So I don't know what the other pros. I mean, I guess the 88 millimeter
High velocity and all the rest of it. It's pretty fearsome, but there are pragmatic problems. The big problem is that the Germans are incapable of mass production on a scale that the Americans could do. In fact, even the British could do. I mean, they're just not in that league. The reason they're not in that league is because they're in the middle of Europe. They don't have access to the world's oceans. They don't have a merchant fleet. They can't get this stuff. It hasn't gone to everyone in the Soviet Union. They can't process it, and they're being bombed 24 hours a day. And so all their factories are, having to split them all up, and that is inherently inefficient because then having to kind of move different parts around, and you're then having the whole process of having to travel from one place to another to get stuff. You haven't got much fuel. So the consequence of that is that what you do is you think, okay, well, we can't mass produce, so let's make really brilliant tanks. But they've lost sight of what really brilliant is. Really brilliant to their eyes is big, scary, big gun, lots of armor. Okay. But actually, what conflict in World War II shows you is that you need more than that. You need ease of maintenance, you need reliability. And the problem with having the bigger the tank, the more complex the maintenance equipment is. You need a bigger hoist, which then means you need a bigger truck, which then uses more fuel. So, for example, the Tiger tank is so big that it doesn't fit on the loading gauge of the European railway system. So they have to have different tracks to roll onto the wagons that will then transport them from A to B, take them from West Germany to Normandy. Then you have to take them off, then you have to take off the tracks, put on combat tracks, then move them into battle and hope that they don't break down. The problem is when you start the war, it's not very automotive, and you've only got 47 people for every motorized vehicle in Germany compared to 3 in the United States or 8 in France, is that you've got lots of people who don't know how to drive. It also means you haven't got lots of garages and mechanics and gas stations and so on. And so you're then creating an incredibly complex beast, but you want that complex thing to be as simple as you possibly can be. And that's the beauty of the Sherman tank. All those guys in America, they're used to driving stick cars. There's 3 people for every automobile, and that includes, the old and children. So almost, every young man knows how to drive. And when you get into a Sherman tank, it's got a clutch, it's got a throttle, the brakes are the steering mechanism. The clutch is where you would expect the clutch to be. It's got a manual shift. You put your foot on the clutch and you shove it into second gear and off you go, or reverse or whatever. And it literally couldn't be easier. Anyone who could drive a stick car could drive a Sherman tank. Seriously. Not everyone could drive a Tiger tank. It's incredibly complex. Really, really is. And that comes with a whole host of problems. And of course, you don't have the numbers. You don't have the numbers. You've got 1,347 of them. You've got 492 King Tigers, which are even bigger. And at a time where you are really short of fuel, you're really short of absolutely everything. And those shells are huge, and they're harder to manhandle. And weird little things that the Germans do, for all their design genius, the loader is always on the right-hand side. Now, in the 1920s and 19 teens and 30s, children were taught to be right-handed. You weren't allowed to be left-handed.
Oh
So
my
you were
God.
right-handed. So you want to be on the left-hand side of the gun, so you can take the shell from your right and swivel it into the breech from your right side. But the loader in a yak panther or a panther or a tiger is always on the right-hand side of the breech, which is ergonomically makes no sense whatsoever. Why did they do this? I've never found an answer to this. But so there's all these little things, and as a soldier coming up against, you're an American GI and you're coming up against a Tiger tank, you don't care about the fact that it's difficult to maintain or the problems involved of trying to get it to the battlefield. All you care about is this monster coming in front of you. It's squeaking and clanking away and it's incredibly scary and it's about to blow you to bits. That's all you care about, and quite understandably so. But those who are protracting the war at a higher level, and historians that come subsequently and look at all this stuff, they do need to worry about all these things. And I remember the same Georg Thomas, the architect of the Hunger Plan. I found this minutes of this meeting, which I think was either on the 4th of December or the 5th of December 1941. So it's just before the Red Army counterattacks outside Moscow in the winter of 1941. And it's a meeting about weaponry. And this is a verbatim quote. He says, "We have to stop making such complete and aesthetic weapons."
Mm-hmm.
In other words, we've constantly been building over-engineered and aesthetically pleasing weapons up until this point. And they sort of half manage it, but don't quite.
We could probably talk for many hours about each of these topics.
Please
we
do.
could talk for 10 hours about tanks. I encourage people to listen to your podcast, World War II Pod. We have ways of making you talk. It's great.
But yeah, we also do. We got a new YouTube channel and website called World War II Headquarters. There are lots of walking the ground and videos of that and all sorts of stuff and little explainers of getting around tanks and stuff and the weaponry and documents and photographic archives. So the idea is to sort of turn it into a kind of real hub of anyone who's interested in this subject. It's a place where they can go and find out just a whole load more.
I love it. So, like I said, we could probably talk for many hours on each of these topics, but let's look at some of the battles, and maybe you can tell me which jumps out at you. I want to talk to you about the Western Front, and definitely talk about Normandy.
Mm-hmm.
But so there's the Battle of Midway,
Yeah.
in 1942, which is a naval battle. There's Eastern Front, Stalingrad, probably the deadliest battle in human history. Then there's the Battle of Kursk,
Yeah.
which is a tank battle, the largest tank battle in history, probably the largest battle period in history. 6,000 tanks, 2 million troops, 4,000 aircraft.
Mm-hmm.
And then that takes us also to the Battle of the Bulge in Normandy, the Italian campaign that you talk a lot about. So what do you think is interesting to try to extract some wisdom from before we get to Normandy? Do you find, as a historian, the Battle of Kursk or the Battle of Stalingrad more interesting? Stalingrad is often seen as the turning.
Well, I think so.
Okay, before getting to Stalingrad, over here, because of the twist, there is a complex nature to it. And the one of the major sentences that I try to apply whenever I paint is the sentence by my hero Steve Houston, that monsters are interlocked and overlap. It's not where pectorals major end and deltoid begins. They're interlocked and overlapped. So all of these lost and find edges are trying to define the muscle as a structure, the skeleton it covers, the movement it supports within the texture of the muscle goes with the movement, the range of the movement of the shoulder blade, it's all interlocked and overlapped. So yeah, it's tricky to say the least. And over here now, what I have is the like a very defined hardcore contrast when deltoid comes out of the armpit, which is a tricky thing because hardly you study in an anatomy book the interaction underneath the armpit, the way that muscles comes together, and because usually it's from the front view and it's like a very clean neat shapes that you study when you study anatomy, but that's how you get trained, by doing it from live models. And in this case I have a picture of a model, so I just have to bring this connection into life by paying attention to the shapes and paying attention to how they follow the underlying structure, and whatever shape I put in have to follow it, otherwise it wouldn't make sense. Okay, Stalingrad.
I mean, it's really interesting. So they get through 1941. Barbarossa doesn't happen as the Germans hope it will. The whole point is to completely destroy the Red Army in 3 months. That just doesn't happen. And I think you can argue, and argue convincingly, that by, let's say, beginning of December 1941, Germany is just not going to win. It just can't. And let me tell you what I mean by that. So if you take an arbitrary date, let's say the 15th of June 1941, Germany at that moment has one enemy, which is Great Britain, albeit Great Britain plus Dominion Empire. Fast forward 6 months to, let's say, the 16th of December. It's got 3 enemies. It's got Great Britain, Dominion Empire, USSR, and the USA. It is just not going to win. For all the talks of wonder weapons and all the rest of it, it's just not going to. It has lost that battle. Having said that, the Soviet Union is still in a really, really bad situation. It is being helped out a huge amount by supplies from the United States and from Britain. Just unprecedented amounts of material being sent through the Arctic or across Alaska into the Soviet Union at that time. It is absolutely staggering how much is committed by Roosevelt and Churchill to try and stem the flow in the Soviet Union, because for all the announcements and the pride that the Soviet Union has about moving factories to the other side of the Urals and stuff, which they do in 1941, huge amounts are overrun intact by the Germans in the opening stages of Barbarossa. I mean, really, colossal losses, huge amounts. So, the grain is gone, coal is gone, entire factories are gone, steel production goes down by kind of, 80% in the Soviet Union in 1941 and into 1942. So in 1942, despite the vast amount of numbers of men that they have at their hands, I mean, they create 80 new divisions in the second half of 1941, for example. I mean, Britain never has 80 divisions in the entire Second World War, division being about, rule of thumb, 15,000 men. So, despite that, and that is because Stalin's meddling, the woeful state of the Red Army in 1941, etc., which we've already sort of touched upon. So in 1942, it's still in a really bad way, but Germany's in a really bad way too. The attrition it suffered in 1941, it's winning itself to death in 1941. So it's having these huge great encirclements, like the encirclement of Kiev in September 1941, capturing the further kind of best part of 700,000 Red Army troops, etc., etc. But in the process of doing that, it is constantly being attrited, both in battle casualties, but in also mechanical casualties too. Just can't cope. It's just the scale is just too big. And what happens is, with every moment that the German forces, that ultimate victory slips away, so Hitler's personal handling of the battle increases. And, say what you like about him, but he just hasn't had the military training to do that. He might have amazing attention to detail. He might be able to understand, have an enormous capacity to remember units and where they are on a map. But he was only a half corporal in the First World War. He's never been to staff college. He might have read lots about Frederick the Great, I mean, I've read lots of history, but that doesn't mean to say I'll be a competent field marshal. So he is not the right person for the job at all, and he micromanages and he looks at figures and figures and doesn't understand what it's like at the actual front, the coalface. So he's stifling the very thing that made the German army effective, which is the ability to give commanders at the front the freedom on their leash to be able to make decisions and battle command decisions. And he's taken that away from them. So he's basically making them go into battle with decreasing amounts of supplies and firepower, and with one hand behind their back in terms of decision-making process. And that is not a good combination.
Okay.
The other problem is that he decides, rather than going for Moscow in 1942, because basically there's a kind of cooling off period in the winter because of the conditions. But everyone knows, the Soviet Union, the Red Army knows that the moment spring comes, there's going to be another offensive, be another major offensive in the summer. That is absolutely as certain as, day following night, etc. The problem that the Germans have is they just don't have enough. They have less than they had when they launched Barbarossa the previous year. The Soviet Union has more. It is better prepared. It knows what's coming now. It's kind of learning some of the lessons, starting to absorb the lessons. Stalin, coincidentally, is pulling back from his very tight leash in the way that Hitler is doing the opposite and increasing his micromanagement and control freakery. And what Hitler decides is, rather than going for Moscow, he's going to go for the oil fields. And this is absolutely insane, because what's going to happen when they get to the oil fields? I mean, does he think really that the Soviet Union are going to let those oil fields come into German hands intact? Even if he does let them get in intact, what are they going to do with that oil? I mean, oil needs to be refined. Where are you going to refine it? They don't have any oil. They don't have many oil refineries. How are you going to ship that oil to where you need it to be in the factories in the Third Reich and into your, process it into gasoline, and then get it to diesel and get it to your U-boats, get it to your tanks, get it to your armored units? How are you going to do that? How do you transport it from the Caucasus, which is a long, long way away from Berlin? How are you going to do that? There's no pipelines. There's only some pipelines. They've been built by American money and American engineering, and they're going backwards towards the Urals, not forwards. They have no more rail capacity whatsoever. They just don't have the oil tankers. So it is absolute la-la land. It is incredible that when you look at the detailed literature that the Germans have, no one is asking this question in the spring and early summer of 1942.
The logistics question in part.
No one is saying, okay, it's great that we're going to go to the Caucasus and get all this oil, but then what? No one is asking that question.
Nor how do you provide resources and feed and the soldiers and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it's...
So the case proved, first of all, they get distracted by going into Crimea, and they go, well, we've got to do that first. So they have to get Sevastopol and Crimea, which they do. And then they have to push on. And at this point, suddenly looming in front of them is Stalingrad, on the banks of the Volga, this city, this industrial city, which has Stalin's name. And Hitler goes, okay, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to split my forces. So half of you can go south towards the Caucasus, and the rest of you can confront Stalingrad. And Bock, just who's the commander, just goes, that's nuts. That makes no sense whatsoever. You're splitting the mission. So Hitler fires it. So suddenly they get into this assault for Stalingrad. And it becomes this sort of street fight. Street fighting is the worst kind of fighting. I mean, the reason why the Israelis have just blown everything up in Gaza is because otherwise you can't see. You need a field of fire. This is fighting in a build-up area is horrendous.
Yeah, to clarify, we're talking about urban warfare, door-to-door, building to building.
It's incredibly difficult. And home advantage is colossal in this instance. And of course, it's piping hot when they attack in kind of August into early September, and then it suddenly gets very, very cold. And at the same time, American mechanization, and slightly a British mechanization, but primarily American trucks, are enabling Zhukov to plan this great pincer movement. So it is, and Russians will hate me for saying this, and I probably will get a whole load of bots on the back of it, but the truth is it is not the street fighting that destroys Sixth Army. It is the encirclement, the subsequent encirclement. So the Germans have been sucked into this street battle in Stalingrad. We cannot give up. We cannot give up. We cannot back down. We cannot pull out. We've got to destroy this city. Meanwhile, while their backs are turned, and while most of their forces are going off to the Caucasus on a wild goose chase for absolutely zero oil, incidentally, and they never get remotely close to Baku. This huge Great Pincer movement is being planned, and it is only possible through mechanization from the United States. And that is the big turning point, because from that moment onwards, the Germans are on the back foot. They're basically going backwards. There are little small counterattacks. There is obviously the Kursk salient, for example, but it's game over. The catastrophe of the surrender of the final surrender. I mean, the Reichs got the wall at the end of 1942, but by November 1942, when the two Soviet fronts meet up, then there is no possible chance of escape for the Sixth Army, and they are consigned, they are toast. And their final surrender obviously happens at the very beginning of February 1943, but that's all over. And then at the same time that is happening, disaster is unfolding in North Africa, because Hitler has insisted on massively resupplying the Mediterranean theatre. And the problem there is the amount of equipment that is lost in North Africa is greater than it is at Stalingrad. I don't think you could argue that psychologically Tunisia is a greater loss than Stalingrad. It absolutely isn't. But you have to see them in tandem. As this is two fronts. This is Eastern Front, Southern Western Front, and this is the first time that the Americans have been on the ground against Axis forces, and they lose big time. The Allies become masters of the North African shores on the 13th of May 1943, and it is a catastrophe. And in that time, 2,700 Luftwaffe aircraft have been destroyed over North Africa between November 1942 and May 1943. And overall, the subsequent that summer as well. It's really interesting. The Luftwaffe lose between June and October 1943. So this is including the Kursk battle, which takes place in July 1943. Okay. In that period, the Luftwaffe loses 702 aircraft over the Eastern Front, but 3,704 aircraft over the Mediterranean. So I think one has to also, one of the lessons about studying the Second World War is one has to be careful not to assign strategic importance to boots on the ground. It can be of great strategic importance, but not necessarily. No one would argue, for example, that the Guadalcanal is not an absolutely game-changing battle in the Pacific War, and yet the number of troops compared to what's going on the Eastern Front or even the Western Front is tiny in comparison. So it is absolutely true that the most German blood is lost on the Eastern Front, but that doesn't mean to say that it's more strategically important than the Western Front. And it's not saying that the Western Front is more strategic either. It's just you have to kind of be balanced about this. The psychological blow, though, of Stalingrad is immense, and you cannot belittle that.
And there's we went over it really fast, but there is a human drama element.
Yes.
But yes, when we're talking about the operational side, the material loss of a battle is also extremely important to the big picture of the war. And we often don't talk about that. Because, of course, with war, the thing to focus on is the human drama of it.
Yes.
Because we're humans.
And I also think that what's interesting is the Nazi High Command's response to Stalingrad, which is not to go, we're screwed, it's to double down. It's, then so Goebbels, for example, gives his infamous speech in the Sports Palace in third week of February 1943, where he goes, are you ready for this? This is now total war. The war is coming. This is a fight for survival. We're all in it together. You are in this as well. Every single German is now, this is a fight for survival. And we are now in total war. And everyone is just so depressed by this. I mean, they realize that they are going to reap what they have sown. Because everyone knows what's been going on the Eastern Front. Because first part of the war, Germans have loads and loads of cameras. They're really into photographing everything, taking city footage of everything. Still part of recording the greatness of the Reich and the triumphs of the Reich. They want to record it, so all this stuff is a bit like the radios, is made very, very cheap. So lots of having, and people are sending it all back. And the people that are developing this stuff are all seeing it, and people are talking about it, and then it's been sent to families, and they're all seeing it, and they're seeing pictures of Jews being rounded up and beaten, and they're seeing Ukrainian partisans being executed, and they're seeing villages being torched, and everyone knows. They all know.
Yeah.
This whole idea is, did they really know what was going on? Yeah, they do. They do know what's going on. You know, to lesser or greater detail, of course. You know, there's some people who don't. And, you know, a bit like people know about the news today. Some people do, some people don't. I never read the newspaper. I never listen to the news. You know, so you have that, of course. But it is widely understood and widely known that really brutal things have been going on in the East, and troops coming back utterly traumatized by what they have taken part in, what they have witnessed, the kind of unspeakable brutality. This is war on a completely different level to anything that's been kind of seen in recent years.
Yeah, we should mention that, you know, the Western Front and the Eastern Front are very different in this regard.
Yes.
So a lot of the Holocaust by bullets, the Holocaust with the concentration camps, extermination camps, is not in Germany. It's not in the Western Front. It's in Poland. It's in the Soviet Union.
Yeah, but don't forget that even Auschwitz, for example, is part of the new Reich. It is part of, you know, it is part of an area which has been absorbed into Germany. So as far as they're concerned, this has now got, you know, it's now no longer got the Polish name. It's now called Auschwitz, which is a German name. It is part of Germany, and there are German people moving there into this, you know, kind of model town, and they all know exactly what's going on.
Yeah, you, by the way, have a nice podcast series of 4 episodes on Auschwitz, the evolution of the dream world town that becomes a camp, a work camp, that becomes an extermination camp.
And a big Buna factory for IG Farben, which never produces a single bit of rubber.
So this, for sure, is something I would have to dive deep in. There's a book you recommended, KL.
Yes, it's just called KL. It's about the whole concentration camp system, because K is Konzentration in German. Lager is a camp. It's an exhaustive book, and I'm full of admiration for him for writing it, just because, jeepers, it must have been so. I mean, I was very depressed doing that work on Auschwitz, that deep dive. I just whole book on it. I don't know.
I think in the details, there's 2 ways I think to look at the Holocaust. One is Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, sort of this philosophical thing about how a human being can confront that and find meaning in what it means. What does the human condition look like in the context of such evil? And then there is the more sort of detailed, okay, well, how do you actually implement something like the final solution? So you have this ideology of evil implemented.
Yes.
And at the fine detail of what are the different technologies used, what are the different humans in the hierarchy of humans in a camp, what's the actual experience of the individual person who shows up at a camp. Just get into the details, and in those details, I think there's some deep, profound human truth that can emerge. That the mundane, one step at a time, is how you can achieve evil.
Yeah.
So yeah, you can get lost in the mundane.
Yes, the banality of evil. It's incredible. I think what is so completely horrific is that, you know, half the 6 million were killed by kind of bullets to the back of the head. And the reason they stopped doing that, and they wanted to stop doing that, was because the perpetrators were finding it so traumatic. You know, Himmler goes and visits an execution in Ukraine, or maybe he's in the Baltic states. I can't remember where he goes, but he witnessed some in the summer of 1941. He thinks, oh, that's horrible. You know, we don't have to do that. I don't want my men having to do that. Got to find a more humane way of doing it. When you talk about a more humane way of doing it, humane for the executioners, not for the victims, because trust me, Zyklon B is not a nice way to go. You know, it basically is bursting all the capillaries in your lungs. It's extremely painful, and you can no longer breathe, and it can take up to 20-25 minutes. You know, some people it can take a couple of minutes, but all of those who are standing naked in that gas chamber, first of all, extremely humiliated by this process in the first place. Then there's some realization that they're not having a shower, they're actually being gassed, and they're all going to die. Imagine what you're thinking as that process is you, because you might be the first, but you're still going to, even the first person is going to know that I can't breathe and I'm dying. Everyone else is going to see the first few dying, and then going to realize that is what's going to happen to them. And you've got those minutes, sometimes many minutes, where you've got to contemplate that, and that's in extreme pain and panic. And just think about how cruel that is.
While being humiliated all the way through.
While being humiliated all the way through. And so, the inverted commas humanity of the gas chambers is anything but. It's disgusting. And the fact that people could do this is just beyond horrific. And then the fact that you are taking your Jewish prisoners and getting them to cut off all the hair, pull out the teeth of the dead before you put them on a lift and incinerate them. If you go to Auschwitz now and you go to the collapsed and blown up gas chambers, which the Germans destroyed before the Russians overran them in January 45, you can still see some of the ash ponds. And there are bits of bone there, but still there from the ash. It is utterly repulsive. And imagine arriving from that train on that incredibly long journey where you've had no comforts whatsoever. You've had humiliations and privation, the privations you've had to suffer as a result of that. Having to come and defecate in a bucket in the corner in front of other people. It's just horrendous. And then you get there bewildered, and immediately your kids are taken away from you, or your husband and wife who've been married 20 years, they're separated just like that. Sent off into different groups, straight to the gas chambers. I mean, the scale of cruelty is so immense. It's hard to fathom, and the thing that I find really difficult to reconcile, and this is where I think the warning from history is important, is that Germany is such an amazing nation. It's the country of Beethoven and Strauss and of Goethe and incredible art and culture and some of the greatest engineers and scientists that have ever lived. And look how quickly it flipped into the descent of unspeakable inhumanity, which manifested itself in the Holocaust and the gas chambers, and those executions into pits and tiny places and creeks in Lithuania or Ukraine or whatever. I mean, it's just horrendous. And this is from a nation which a decade earlier had been a democracy.
It seems like as a human civilization, we walk that Solzhenitsyn line between good and evil.
Yeah.
It's a thin line. We have to walk it carefully.
Yes.
So one of the great battles in World War II on the Western Front is Normandy. I have to talk to you about Normandy. D-Day. The Normandy landings, the famous on June 6, 1944. This was Allied invasion of Nazi-occupied Western Europe.
Yeah.
What was the planning? And it was lengthy planning. What was the planning? What was the execution of the Normandy landings?
Well, the decision to finally go, when the Americans joined the war in December 1941, there's the Arcadia Conference a few days later, a week later, between the British chiefs of staff and political leaders in Churchill and Roosevelt and his own chiefs of staff about what the policy should be. And the policy is to get American troops over to Europe as quickly as possible, get them over to Britain, get them training, and get them across the Channel ASAP. And start the liberation of Europe. But the reality is that in 1942 the Americans just aren't ready. They've gone from this incredibly tiny army, they're still growing. They've got no battlefield experience. The British are still recovering. They're good on the naval power. They're kind of increasingly good on air power. But land power they've had to kind of make up from the loss of their ally France and expand as well. So kind of ground zero for both America and Britain has been kind of June 1940, when France is out, and suddenly that's the strategic earthquake, and that's the issue that needs settling, and they need to just completely realign everything that they'd fought in 1939. They've got to start again. But it's also becomes clear that they're not really ready in 1943 either. And one of the problems is that Molotov, who is the Soviet foreign minister, has come over to Britain in May 1942 and said, we need you to kind of do your bit and get on the campaign trail against the Germans and fight on the ground. And the British will go, well, yeah, but cross-channel invasion is not really going to happen. We know we're doing that in North Africa at the moment. And then he goes over to Washington and And the Americans go, we are definitely going to go and take on the attack to the Germans in 1942. They've made this promise. So in the summer of 1942, it becomes clear that they can't keep that. So Churchill says, well, look, here's an idea. We've already got an army in Egypt. Why don't we land another one in Northwest Europe? Northwest Africa. That's run by Vichy France, which is pro-Axis French colonies. Why don't we take that? We can do that, and then we can meet in the middle. We can pincer around. We can conquer the whole of North Africa. You can kill with 2 birds with 1 stone because you can get some experience fighting against Axis troops. Test some of your equipment and commanders. What's not to like, and then we can sort of see how it goes. So this is a kind of opportunistic strategy, whereas the Americans are very much sort of, we want to draw a straight line to Berlin, and that's the quickest way, and let's do it that way. So it's a kind of a different viewpoint, but Roosevelt kind of gets that and agrees to that. So that's where the whole North Africa Mediterranean campaign comes from. And as a consequence of the huge commitment to Tunisia, 3,500 aircraft, huge navies, 2 allied armies in North Africa by the time Tunisia is won in mid-May 1943. Well, we've got all this here. We might as well kind of really try and put the nail into the coffin of Italy's war, get them out of the battle. Sicily is an obvious one. Let's go in there, and then we can take a view. But between Sicily happening and the fall of North Africa is the Trident Conference in Washington. And that is where the decisions made. The Americans go, okay, enough of this opportunistic stuff. Let's just, we get it, we buy it, but no more faffing around. May 1944, 1 year hence, we are going to cross the Atlantic. And the British go, okay, fair call, we'll do that. So that is where Operation Overlord, as it gets given its code name, its operational name. That's when the planning starts. Serious planning starts at the beginning of 1944. And one of the lessons from Sicily to Normandy is that you can't have commanders fighting one battle whilst preparing for the next one. So you have to have a separate command structure. And that's okay, because by this time we've got enough people that have got experience of battlefield command that you can actually split it. There are very good reasons for going into Italy, not least getting the Foggia airfields, so that you can further tighten the noose around Nazi Germany. And one of the great prerequisites for the Normandy invasion is total control of the airspace, not just over Normandy, but over a large swathe of Northwest Europe. Why is that? Because the moment you land in Normandy, the cat is out of the bag. And it's then a race between which side can build up men and material quickest. Is it going to be the Allies who've got to come from southern England, which is a distance of a slow journey across seas, and the distance between kind of 80 and 130 miles away? Or is it going to be the Germans that are already on the continent? Well, clearly on paper it's the Germans, so you have to slow up the Germans. Well, how do you do that? We do that by destroying their means of getting there. So bridges, destroy all the bridges over the Seine, destroy all the bridges over the River Loire, hit the marshalling yards. The glue that keeps the German war machine together is the Reichsbahn, the German railway network. So destroy the railway as much as you possibly can and make it difficult for the Germans to reinforce the Normandy bridgehead as and when it comes. But the way you do that in turn is by very low-level precision bombing, and that has to be done by twin-engine, faster, smaller bombers going in low. But the problem is you can't go low and destroy those bridges if you've got Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts hovering above you. So you've got to destroy those, which is why you need to have air superiority over this large swathe of Northwest Europe to do that. The problem is that while the industrial heartland of Nazi Germany is in the west, is in the Ruhr area, which is very convenient for bombers coming out of Lincolnshire or East Anglia on the flat east side of Great Britain. The aircraft industry is much deeper into the Reich, and it is beyond the range of fighter escorts for the bombers. And the American daylight bombers who are going over are discovering that despite being called flying fortresses, they're not fortresses, they're actually getting decimated. And whenever their bombers go in strength over to try and hit the aircraft industry in Germany, beyond fighter range, they get decimated. First, infamously, on the Schweinfurt-Recklinghurst raid on the 17th of August 1943, coincidentally the same day that Sicily falls to the Allies, and also coincidentally the same day that face-to-face negotiations begin with the Italians for an armistice in Lisbon. But on that day, of the 324 heavy bombers that the Americans send over to hit Schweinfurt and Regensburg, where there are a Messerschmitt plant and also a ball bearing plant, which is essential for aircraft manufacturing, they lose 60 shot down and a further 130 odd really, really badly damaged. And even for the vast numbers of manpower and bombers that are coming out of America, this is too much. So they can't sustain it. So they've got to find a fighter escort that's going to be able to escort them all the way into the Reich, and the race is on, because basically if they haven't got one airspace by April 1944, it's game over. You can't do a cross-channel invasion. You have to have that control of the airspace beforehand. So the race is on. Unfortunately, they come up with a solution, which is the P-51 Mustang, which has originally been commissioned in May 1940 by the British, developed from sketches to reality in 117 days. It's a work of absolute genius, but to start off, it's harnessed with a really bad engine. The Allison engine is just not right for that aircraft. And it's not until a Rolls-Royce Merlin, which is the same one that powers the Lancaster, the Mosquito, and the Spitfire and Hurricane, is put into the P-51 Mustang, that suddenly you've got your solution, because that means it can now fly with extra drop tanks and fuel tanks. It can, it's so aerodynamic, and it's so good. The higher it goes with this engine, the more fuel efficient it becomes. It can actually fly, over 1,400 miles, which gets you not just to Berlin and back, but to Warsaw and back. So suddenly you've got that solution. And actually, by April 1944, they have cleared airspace, and by the end of May 1944, just on the eve of the invasion, Operation Overlord, the closest German aircraft that is seen fighting Allied aircraft is 500 miles from the beachhead. So it is absolutely job done. Meanwhile, new fighter, comparatively new ground attack fighter planes like Typhoons and Tempests and adapted P-47 Thunderbolts are attacking the German radar stations all along the coastline, because they now do have an air defense system. They're destroying kind of 90% of their effectiveness. And in the intelligence game, they're winning that one as well. They're just much better, because in Germany, intelligence is power. So people tend to, and Hitler always has this kind of divide and rule thing going on. So you have parallel command structures, which is not conducive to bringing together of intelligence. And while much play has been made about the successes of Bletchley and code breaking and all the rest of it, actually, what you have to do is you have to see the kind of the decrypts that the Bletchley cryptanalysts do as just a cog, and those various cogs together, from listening services to photo reconnaissance to agents on the ground to what's it, the cogs collectively add up to more than some of their individual parts. And so the intelligence picture is a broad picture rather than just code breaking. But anyway, they win that particular battle as well. And what you see really with D-Day is the zenith of coalition warfare. What you've got multiple nations who have different overall aims, different cultures, different attitudes, different start points, but they have all coalesced into one common goal. Until they've achieved that common goal, they're going to put differences to one side. Much play has been made about kind of Anglophobia amongst American commanders and Americophobia amongst Allied, British commanders, but actually it's nothing. It's a marriage made in heaven compared to the way Germany looks after its own allies, for example. And what is remarkable about the Allies is they're not actually allies; they're coalition partners. There's no formal alliance at all, and there is a subtle difference there. But what you see them is that you see them really, really pulling together, and you see that manifest itself on D-Day. I think, where you've got 6,939 vessels, of which there are 1,213 warships, 4,127 assault craft, 12,500 aircraft, 155,000 men landed and dropped from the air in 24-hour period. It is phenomenal. It is absolutely phenomenal. And while it is still seen as a predominantly American show, all three service commanders are British. It is most of the aircraft are, 2/3 of the aircraft are British. 2/3 of the men landed are British and Dominion. You never forget the Canadians, who consistently punch massively above their weight in the Second World War, in all aspects, it has to be said, air, land and sea. They're key at the Battle of the Atlantic, they're key in air power, they're key at D-Day, and indeed in the Battle for Italy as well. So the Canadians should never be forgotten. But one of the reasons it is is the British Navy that dominates in D-Day is because, of course, the incredibly enormous strength of the Royal Navy in the first place, but partly because most of the US Navy is by this stage in the Pacific, fighting its own fight. So it's not slacking by any stretch of the imagination. It is because it's elsewhere doing its bit for the kind of overall Allied cause. But D-Day is just extraordinary, and despite the terrible weather, which is such a debilitating factor in the whole thing. I mean, it puts people off course, means many more people get killed on Omaha Beach than they might have done, and on other beaches besides, incidentally. And actually, in terms of lives lost, proportionally, it is the Canadians that suffer the worst, more so than the Americans. It's just there's fewer of them overall. D-Day has to be seen as an unqualified success. I mean, it is absolutely extraordinary what they achieve, and while they don't 100% achieve their overall D-Day objectives, you know, the objectives are always going to be the outer reach of what can be achieved, and you'd need absolutely perfect conditions for that to happen, and they don't get perfect conditions. But they're so balanced, they've so thought of absolutely everything, and their logistics fly. And I mean, even things like the minesweeping operation is the biggest single minesweeping operation of the entire war, because there's huge minefields off the Normandy coast, and ahead of the invasion force, the minesweepers, which amount to, I think, something like 242 different minesweepers in 5 different operations opposite every single beach, creating lanes through these minefields through which the invasion force can go. Not a single ship is lost to a mine in the actual invasion. That is phenomenal, and can only be done with the greatest of skill and planning, and all in a period where, you know, there are no computers, there's no GPS, there's nothing. I mean, it is absolutely astonishing, and the scale of it is just frankly mind-boggling.
Yeah, and that was really the nail in the coffin, the beginning of the end.
Yeah.
For Hitler, for the European theater.
Yeah. Once you get the only cause for doubt is, will they be able to secure that bridgehead? The moment they get that bridgehead, it is game over. There's only, you know, there is no other way it's going to be, because of the overwhelming amount of men and material that the Allies have compared to the Germans at this stage of the war. Mm. And of course, you know, you're being attacked on 3 fronts, because there's the Italian front to the south, and of course, in a very major way, you've also got the Eastern Front. And Operation Bagration, which is launched that summer as well, is enormous.
So let's go to the Hitler sitting in his bunker, his suicide, Germany's surrender. You actually said that Downfall, the movie, was a very accurate representation.
I think it is, really. Except the girls took cyanide and shoot herself.
Details, but I think it might be my favorite World War II movie, which is strange to say because it's not really about World War II. It's about Hitler in a bunker. But
I think wasn't it Bruno Ganz, wasn't it? I think he nailed him.
Yeah,
there's so many accounts of that. There's so much written about Hitler. There's millions and millions of Hitler's words that you can read. You know, there are translations of many of his conferences. You can see what he's saying. You can get inside his head in a very clear way, and much more clearly than you can Stalin or just about any other leader, really. And so one has a very, very strong impression of what Hitler was like in the bunker in those last days. There's so many accounts of it, and it just feels like they nailed it. It just feels like they've got it spot on.
I mean, it's a fascinating story of evil maniac, and this certainty, you know, crumbling, right? Like realizing that this vision of the 1,000-year Reich is.
And Hitler says, you know, my reputation might be good to start off with, but I hope in a few years' time that people will start to realize the kind of all the good I was trying to bring.
Yeah,
absolutely.
They're all the same, aren't they? You always believe you're doing good.
Yeah.
And there's so many deep lessons there. So now you have written so much, you've said so much, you've studied this so much. What do you, looking at World War II, is the lessons we should take away?
Well, I suppose it's what happens when you allow these individuals to take hold of great power and great authority and make these terrible decisions. If you allow that to happen, you know, there are consequences, and you have to recognize the moments of trouble when they arise. So when there are financial crises, you know that political unrest is going to come, and you need to be prepared for that. You know, you need to be able to see the writing on the wall. You can't be complacent. You know, complacency is such a dirty word, isn't it? You know, you've got to keep your wits, and you can't take things for granted. You've got to recognize, I think, that the freedoms we enjoy in the West are
Fragile.
they're not necessarily permanent, and you need to make the most of them while you've got them and cherish them and consider what happens if the milk turns sour and what the consequences of that are. I mean, actually overriding. Because although I don't think there'll ever be a war on the scale of the Second World War, you've only got to look at pictures of those opening days of the war in Ukraine and see sort of knocked out Russian tanks and dead bodies, bloated bodies all over the place, put that into black and white, and it could be the road out of Falaise in 1944, it could be any number of German battlefields and in World War II, and the similarities and the trenches and the kind of people hiding in foxholes, and that's horribly reminiscent, as are the huge casualties that they're suffering on both sides, whether they be Russian or Ukrainian. And it's a shock. It's a shock to see that, and it reminds you just how quickly I think things can descend. I mean, that's the other thing. That point I was making about how quickly Germany descended from this amazing nation of arts and culture and science and development and engineering into one of the Holocaust. I mean, life is fragile and peace is fragile, and it's you take it for granted at your peril.
And you take for granted at our peril that nobody will use nuclear weapons ever again. And that's not a thing we should take for granted.
No, sir.
What gives you hope about the future of human civilization? We've been talking about all of this darkness in the 20th century. What's the source of light?
The source of light is that I think the vast majority of people are good people who
Doesn't matter if they're
peacefully, want
complacent.
to live happily, and are not filled with hate. And there are some brilliant minds out there. And I think the capacity for the human brain to come up with new developments and new answers to problems and challenges is infinite. And I think that's what gives me hope.
James, I'm a big fan. This was an honor to talk to you, and please keep putting incredible history out there. I can't wait to see what you do next. Thank you so much for talking to me.
Well, thank you, Lex. It's been a utter privilege to talk to you.
Oh my God.
Thanks for listening to this conversation with James Holland. To support this podcast, please check out our sponsors in the description or at lexfreeman.com/sponsors. And now, let me leave you with some words from Winston Churchill. If you're going through hell, keep going. Thank you for listening, and hope to see you next time.
Oh God.
friends. The following is a conversation with Jeffrey Wasserstrom, a historian of modern China. This is the Last Freedom podcast. To support it, please check out our sponsors in the description. And now, dear friends, there's Jeffrey Wasserstrom. You've compared Xi Jinping and Mao Zedong in the past. What are the parallels between the two leaders, and where do they differ? Xi Jinping, of course, is the current leader of China for the past 12 years, and Mao Zedong was the communist leader of China from 1949 to 1976. So what are the commonalities? What are the differences?
So the biggest commonality of them is that they're both the subject of personality cults, and that Mao was the center of a very intensely felt one from 1949 to 1976. And when he died, there was tremendous outpouring of grief, even among people who had objectively suffered enormously because of his policies. Xi Jinping is the first leader in China since him who has had a sustained personality cult of the kind where if you walk into a bookstore in China, the first thing you see are books by him, collections of his speeches. And when Mao was alive, you might have thought that's sort of what happened with Communist Party leaders in China. But after Mao's death, there was such an effort to not have that kind of personality cult that there was a tendency to not publish the speeches of a leader until they were done being in power. I was first in China in 1986, and you could go for days without being intensely aware of who was in charge of the party. You would know, but his face wasn't everywhere. The newspaper wasn't dominated with stories about him and quotations from his words and things like that. So with Xi Jinping, you had a throwback to that period in Communist Party rule, which seemed as though it might be a part of the past. So that's a key commonality. And a key difference is that Mao really reveled in chaos, in turning things upside down, in a sense that, he talked about class struggle, which came out of Marxism, but he also really, his favorite work of Chinese popular fiction was The Monkey King, about this legendary figure this Monkey King who could turn the heavens upside down. So he reveled in disorder and thought disorder was a way to improve things. Xi Jinping is very orderly, is very concerned with kind of stability and predictability. So you can see them as very, very different that way. And Mao also liked to stir things up, liked to have people on the streets clamoring. So Xi Jinping, even though he has a personality cult, it's not manifesting itself. He doesn't like the idea of people on the streets in anything that can't be controlled. So you can, there are a lot of ways that they're similar, a lot of ways they're different. They're also different, and this fits with this orderliness, that Xi Jinping talks positively about Confucius and Confucian traditions in China. And Confucian traditions are based on kind of stable hierarchies for the most part, and sort of clear categories of superior and inferior, whereas Mao liked things to be turned upside down. He thought of Confucianism as a feudal way of thought that had held China back. So you can come up with things that they're similar, and you can come up with things where they're really opposites, but they both clearly did want to see China under rule by the Communist Party. And that's been a continuity, and that connects them to the leaders in between them too as well.
So there's some degree, as you said, that Xi Jinping espouses the ideas of communism and the ideas of Confucianism. So let's go all the way back. You wrote that in order to understand the China today, we have to study its past. So the China of today celebrates ideas of Confucius, a Chinese philosopher who lived 2,500 years ago. Can you tell me about the ideas of Confucius?
First of all, we don't know that much about the historic Confucius. He's around the same time as figures like Socrates, and like with Socrates, we get a lot of what we know about him or think we know about him from what his followers said, things that were attributed to him, and dialogues that were written afterwards. So you can have a lot of fun with these sort of axial age thinkers and what they had in common. Another thing that connects these axial age thinkers is they were trying to kind of make a case for why they should be able to educate the next generation, the elite, and sort of had a way of promising that they had philosophical ideas that helped decide how you should run a polity. Confucius lived in a time when there were these warring kingdoms in a territory that later became China. But what he said was that there had been this period of great order in the past, that the lines between inferior and superior were clear, and there was a kind of synergy between superior and inferior that kept everything ticking along really nicely. He thought that hierarchical relationships were a good thing, and that the trick was that both sides in a hierarchical relationship owed something to the other. So the father and son relationship was a key one. The father deserved respect from the son, but owed the son care and benevolence. And things would be fine as long as both sides in a relationship held up their end. And he had a whole series of these relationships. The husband to the wife was, again, an unequal one, of the husband being superior to the wife, but him owing the wife care and her owing him deference. And he had the same notion that then the emperor to the ministers these were all parallels. And there were no egalitarian relationships in Confucianism. Even something that in the West we often think of as a kind of quintessentially egalitarian relationship between brothers. In the Chinese tradition of Confucianism, there was only older brother and younger brother. Brotherhood was not an egalitarian relationship. It was one where the older brother took care of the younger brother and the younger brother showed respect for the older brother.
So stable hierarchy was at the core of everything in society. It permeated everything, including politics.
Yeah, and there was even a sense that it connected the natural world to the supernatural world. So the emperor was to heaven this kind of non-personified deity, like the emperor was to the ministers. So all of this had these relationships. So the emperor was the son of heaven. And, for Confucius, he said, so we should study the texts. We should study how the sages of old behaved, that society was becoming corrupted and was going away from that sort of purity of the sages when the relationships were all in order. So Confucianism was a kind of conservative or even backward looking thing. It wasn't arguing for progress, it was arguing for reclaiming a pure golden age in the past. So it was also a kind of conservative. So in all kinds of ways, it's irreconcilable to many things about Marxism and communism, which is all about struggle and all about actually a progressive view of history, moving from one stage to the next.
So that's the interesting thing about Xi Jinping and China today, is there is that tension of Confucianism and communism, where communism, Marxism is supposed to, let go of history, and Confucianism, there's a real veneration of history that's happening in China of today. So they're able to wear both hats and balance it.
Yeah, you could say that in many points in the 20th, a kind of struggle between different competing political groups over which part of the Chinese past to connect with. Was it to the Confucian tradition or to the kind of rebellious Monkey King tradition, which was what Mao connected to? Xi Jinping, and before him to some extent, Hu Jintao, we saw this a little bit at the Olympics, there was more this kind of mix it all together view. Anything that suggested greatness in the past could be something that could be fused together. So Xi Jinping says that, Mao is one of his heroes or one of the people he looks to as a model, but so is Confucius. And there's really, they had so little in common, but they both, in his mind and the minds of others, suggest a kind of power and greatness of the Chinese past.
Yeah, so this Platonic notion of greatness, and that you could say connects, that's a thread that connects for Xi Jinping, the great history, multi-thousand-year history of China.
Yeah, and it involves smoothing out all kinds of internal contradictions. You had, the first emperor of China, jumping forward a bit, in 221 BC, he is anti-scholars. He burns books, and he doesn't venerate these kind of rituals and things. So he is very much against the things that Confucius stood for. and Mao, in a sense of having to choose between Confucius and the first emperor, he said, well, maybe the first emperor had the right idea. Scholars can be a pain. So he said, like, if you have to choose between Confucianism and that. But Xi Jinping, I think, continually is kind of not choosing. And if he wants to say, well, look at the Great Wall, look at this wonderful, that was a symbol of kind of strength and domination related to the first emperor, who, by the way, didn't build anything like the Great Wall you see today. He built walls and they were fine, they were good. But the Great Wall itself didn't come into being until many centuries later. But still, this idea of anything that suggests a kind of greatness is something that, as in many ways, a nationalist above all else, Xi Jinping is a supporter of the single party rule. That's something he clearly believes in. And he's a nationalist. He wants to see China be great and acknowledged as great on the world stage.
Mm-hmm.
Boy, so many contradictions always. With Stalin, he was a communist, but also a nationalist, right? That contradiction is also permeates through Mao all the way to Xi Jinping.
Does it seem to be bothering them?
Confucius for a little bit. You write that one of the most famous statements of Confucianism is the belief that, quote, people are pretty much alike at birth, but become differentiated via learning. So this sets the tradition that China places a high value on education and on meritocracy. Can you speak to this Confucius's idea of education, and how much does it permeate to the China of today?
Sure. So there's an optimism to this. There's an optimism in the sense of a ability that people can be good, exposed to exemplary figures from the past, want to be like those exemplary figures. So it's a form of education through kind of emulation of models and study of past figures and past texts that were exemplary. And it did have this idea, relatively positive view of human nature and the sort of changeability of humans through education. And I think that shows through in all kinds of things, even the fact that while there were lots of killings by the Chinese Communist Party and other groups, there was often an idea that that people could be remolded potentially. And China was one of the few places where they didn't kill the last emperor. The last emperor, the idea was that he could anybody could be kind of turned into a citizen of this, or a subject of this, a good member of this polity, through the kind of education. Often it was a very kind of forceful form of education, but I think that's a carryover from the Confucian times. And over time, this Confucian idea led to the creation of one of the early great civil service exams, an idea that bureaucracy should be run not by people who were born into the right families, but ones who had shown their ability to master these really intensive kind of exams. And the exams were things that could make or break your career, a bit like at some points in the American past, passing a bar exam, a really intensive thing, could set you on the road to a good career. In China, you had the civil service exam tradition. So I think this kind of emphasis on education and on valuing of scholarly pursuits, but then Chinese leaders throughout history, including up to Mao and Xi Jinping, have also found scholars to be tremendously difficult to control. So there's an ambivalence to it, or contradiction again there.
But to which degree this idea of meritocracy that's inherent to the notion that we all start at the same line, there's a meritocratic view of human nature there, where if you work hard and you learn things, you will succeed. And so the reverse, if you haven't succeeded, that means you didn't work hard and therefore do not deserve the spoils of the success. Does that carry over to the China of today?
There's such a challenge in all these forms of meritocracy, because you had the civil service exams, but the question was if you had a really good tutor, if you could afford a really good tutor, you had a better chance of passing the exams. one thing that happened there was families would pool together resources to try to help the brightest in their group to be able to become part of the officialdom. And this kind of pooling together resources to help as a family was an important part of that structure. But there also was a kind of there was always a tension that so what if you don't succeed? Some of the leaders of rebellions against emperors were failed examination candidates. You know, you had this issue, and then it became something. Well, the system was out of whack, and it needed a new leader.
Fucking classic.
And also there was something built in that was not so much Confucius himself, but one of his main interpreters, early interpreters, Mencius, had this idea, which can be seen as a crude justification for rebellion or for a kind of democracy, to say that even though the emperor rules at the will of heaven, if he doesn't act like a true emperor, if he's not morally upstanding, then heaven will remove its mandate to him.
Sure.
And then there's no obligation to show deference for a ruler who's not behaving like a true ruler. And there it sort of justifies rebellion. And the idea is that if rebellion isn't justified, then heaven will stop the ruler from being killed. But if heaven has removed his support, then the rebellion will succeed, and then a new ruler will be justified in taking power. So it's an interesting sense that the universe in this Confucian view has a kind of moral dimension to it, but it also it's when things actually happen that you see where the side of morality is.
Okay, so it's meritocracy with an asterisk. It does seem to be the case, maybe you can speak to that in the Chinese education system, there seems to be a high value for excellence. Hopefully I'm not generalizing too much, but from the things I've seen, there are certain cultures, certain peoples that, you know, it's just part of the value system of the culture that you need to be a really good student. Is that the case with the China of today?
There's been a lot of emphasis on education and sort of working really hard and excelling at some subjects and having, there isn't the civil service exam, but there is the Gaokao, an exam that really can determine where you get, what kind of institution you get into. And I think, getting back to this idea of meritocracy, which is strong in a lot of tradition, it also a kind of what it opens you up to is when there is a sense of unfairness in who's getting ahead and how the spoils are being divided. This leads to a kind of outrage, and some of the biggest protests in China have been about this sense of nepotism, which really seems to subvert this whole idea of kind of meritocracy. And the 1989 protest at Tiananmen, even though kind of in the Western press in particular was discussed as a movement for democracy, but a lot of the first posters that went up that got students really angry were criticisms of corruption within the Communist Party and nepotism, in the sense that people, despite all the talk, despite the fact that most people seem to be having to study really hard to pass these exams to get good positions in universities, that some of them were being handed out via the kind of back door. And that led to a kind of outrage. That's true in many places, but I think it gives a special anger against nepotism because of that, the way in which so much emphasis is put on kind of this standard exam way of getting ahead.
I hope it's okay if we jump around through history a bit and find the threads that connect everything. Since you mentioned Tiananmen Square, you have studied a lot of student protests throughout Chinese history, throughout history in general. What happened in Tiananmen Square?
So in 1989, this massive movement took place. The story of it's largely suppressed within China and largely misunderstood in other places, in part because it happened around the same time that communism was unraveling and ending in the former Soviet bloc. So I think it's often conflated with what was going on there. And so I think one of the key things to know about the protests in 1989 was that they were an effort to get the Communist Party in China to do a better job of living up to its own stated ideals and to try to support the trend within the party toward a kind of liberalizing and opening up form that had taken shape after Mao's death. And in a sense, the student generation of 89, and I was there in 86 when there were some sort of warm-up protests, there was a kind of frustration with what they felt was a half-assed version of what they were talking about. The government was saying, the party was saying, we believe in reforming and opening up, we need to liberalize, we need to give people more control of their fate. And the students felt that this was being done more effectively in the economic realm than in the political realm, and that there were a lot of sort of partial gestures that suggested the party needed to be pressed to really move in that direction. And it'll seem like a very trivial thing, but I found it fascinating in 86 when I was there in Shanghai in late 86, and students protested. And this was the first time that students had been really on the streets in significant numbers since the Cultural Revolution, or at least since 76. And the students were inspired by calls for democracy and discussions of democracy by this physicist, Feng Li-Zhi, who was a kind of a Chinese Sakharov. He was a liberalizing intellectual. But one of the things that students in Shanghai, where some of the most intense protests of that year took place, were frustrated about was a rock concert, of all things, that Jan and Dean, the American surf rock band, which was kind of like the Beach Boys, only not as big, and they were touring China. It was the first time in Shanghai that there'd been a rock concert, and the students were really excited about this because this fit in with what they thought the Communist Party was moving toward, was letting them be more part of the world. And for them, that meant being more in step with pop culture around the world. And at the concert, some students got up to dance because that's what they knew you were supposed to do at a rock concert. And the security guards made them sit down. And for the students in Shanghai, this sort of symbolized what was, a feint toward openness that really didn't have follow through. We're going to give you rock concerts, but not let you dance. And so the protests went on for a little while in 86, and posters went up. The officials at universities said, no, this is out of hand. We had chaos on the streets during the Cultural Revolution. We can't go back to that. And nobody wanted to go back to that. So there were posters I saw that said, this is new Red Guardism. And the students didn't want to be associated with that. So it wound down pretty quickly. And they thought, we're not like the Red Guards. We don't want to make chaos. We also are not fervent loyalists of anybody in power. The Red Guards had been passionate about Mao. The analogy partly sort of scared them, and also it meant that the government was really serious about dealing with them. So then in 1989, this protests restart, and there are a variety of reasons why they can restart. The space for them, students are thinking about doing something in 1989. It's a very resonant year. 200th anniversary of the French Revolution. People are thinking about that. But more importantly, it's the 70th anniversary of the biggest student movement in Chinese history, the May 4th movement of 1919. And the May 4th movement had helped lay the groundwork for the Chinese Communist Party. Some leading founders of it had been student activists then. It was an anti-imperialist movement, but it was also a movement against bad government. And so the students thought, the anniversary of that movement was always marked, commemorated in China, and people took the history seriously. People were reminded of what students did in the past. And so there were a lot of reasons why people were itching to do something. And then a leader, Hu Yaobang, who was associated with the more kind of reformist, more liberalizing group within the Chinese Communist Party. He had been stripped of a very high office, demoted after partly taking a fairly light stance toward the 86, 87 protests. And so he was still a member of the government, but he was not as high up in power. He had been very high up. He had been sort of Deng Xiaoping's potential successor. And he dies unexpectedly. And there has to be a funeral for him because he dies still as an official. And the students take advantage of the opening of there having to be commemorations of his death. And they put up posters that basically say the wrong people